Wait a minute, that's the wrong page. What's your greatest fear this morning? Greatest fear. You know, I read a story, hospital administrator, he was startled when he saw this patient running out of the operating room, his gown flapping in the breeze, and the administrator stopped him and he said, "Whoa, whoa, whoa." He said, "What's wrong?" He could see fear in this patient's eyes. He said, "Man, what is wrong with you?" He said, "It's something that the nurse said in the OR." And he said, "Well, what did she say that's got you so shook up?" And he said that she said, "It nothing to be afraid of. It's quite simple. It's just an appendectomy." And he said, "Well, why are you so afraid of that?" He said, "It is quite simple procedure. I mean, that ought to bring comfort to you." He said, "Why are you so upset?" And he said, "Because she wasn't talking to me, she was talking to the surgeon." That's a good cause to be afraid. What is it that strikes a note of fear in your life? You know, we're heading into to Halloween and haunted houses. Maybe it's a haunted house. Maybe you're afraid of scary movies or something. Maybe you're afraid of speaking in public or standing up in front of a crowd. Maybe you have a fear of heights. I'm that person. I just petrified from heights. And several summers back, I actually bit the bullet and went parasailing. Never do it again, but I did it once and tried to conquer that fear of heights. Maybe your fear is you don't have a date for the prom, or whatever it is. What are your fears? Maybe some of your fears are a little more than just these, what we would say, silly things. Maybe your fear is more serious. Maybe you're down to your last paycheck. Maybe you're down to your last solution. You've tried everything else, and this is the last shot you have at something. Maybe your fear is of being sued or finishing last or being laid off or going broke. Maybe the fear is that mole that's on your back or that lump that you found, and it's caused fear in your life. Maybe your fear is from a test result you got back. Then we could move on out from there and we could talk about universal fears that we probably all share. The fear of terrorism, school shootings that seem like they're happening on a weekly basis now, the fear of road rage, the fear of the stock market plummeting. On and on and on of all these fears that we have. You know, we have sophisticated investment plans. We have state-of-the-art, elaborate security systems. We legislate a stronger military, yet we depend more on mood-altering drugs than any other generation in the history of mankind. I read an article out of Newsweek magazine. It said, ordinary children today are more fearful than the psychiatric patients of the 1950s. Fear is real. We all have our fears. In fact, fear is highly contagious. It's like a virus. It spreads. It can be transmitted from one person to the other. You get a group of people together, and they start talking about their ailments and start talking about their pains and their aches and their sicknesses. And before long in that conversation, somebody in that conversation will say, "Yeah, I had an aunt, or I had an uncle, or a second removed cousin, and they died from that, And all of a sudden, man, fear. Oh, man, could die from this. You see, fear is certainly human. As long as we're alive, we're going to battle with fear. We'll have to wrestle with it. But the key to it is this. The key to it is learning how to manage fear and not let fear manage you. How to manage your fears, wrestle with your fears, and not have your fears to manage you. When fear manages our life, it takes the joy out of living. You see, fear, it kind of puts us in a prison, locks us in, slams the door, and some people spend their entire lives a captive to fear. They're so afraid. They're so afraid of a host of different things, and they live their life paralyzed by fear. Wouldn't it be great to be able to walk out of that prison of fear and imagine your life, living every day of your life without fear? What if fear was your default response to every situation that came along rather than fear? What if you had faith no matter what the situation? What if that was your default response? This is the idea that Jesus brought up in a story we find in Matthew chapter 8. Familiar story. And it starts out in verse 23. It says, and it's up on the screen, I think. Then he got into the boat with his disciples and they followed him. He got into a boat and his disciples followed him. Verse 24, without warning, a furious storm came up on the lake. Now let's stop there for a moment. First, I want you to notice a seemingly contrast in Matthew's statement. He said Jesus got in the boat and the disciples followed him. Now, wouldn't you think if Jesus was in the boat and you got in the boat with Jesus, don't you think that it should have said something like immediately there was a rainbow that appeared and dove began to hover over the boat and the sun began to shine and the birds were singing and the water was crystal clear and calm and you could see the reflection of the landscape around you on the surface of the water? I mean, don't you think it would read like that if Jesus got in the boat and he said, come on guys, get in the boat with me? I mean, I think that is what we would expect, but the story doesn't read that way. In fact, the story reads quite the opposite. And this is something that we have to understand. Getting on board with Jesus sometimes means getting soaked with Jesus. It means getting wet with Jesus. We don't like that, do we? We want to get in the boat with Jesus and everything's great, smooth sailing, sunny skies, calm surface. We don't like that when you start talking about getting in the boat and a storm coming up. We don't like it. I mean, we didn't sign up for Jesus. We thought when we signed up with Jesus, they would get us out of storms, right? But we find out signing up with Jesus sometimes gets us in the storms. I mean, bad things are not supposed to happen if we're following Jesus, right? If we're getting in the boat with Him, they're not supposed to have any bad things happen in our life. But listen to what Jesus said in John chapter 16 and verse 33. He said this, "These things I've spoken to you, that in me you may have peace. In the world you will have, not might, not may, or not could, but in the world you will have tribulation. But be of good cheer, because I've overcome the world." You see, I think often the problem is we live with the illusion that Christ followers don't experience bad things. I mean, we shouldn't because we have Jesus, right? But the reality is Christ followers face cancer, bury children, lose spouses, battle addictions, and as a result, we wrestle with fear. Verse 24, he said, without warning, a furious storm came up on the lake. Other translations read this, suddenly a great tempest arose on the lake. You know, some storms you see coming, and some you don't. Some storms you can see the clouds building, it's getting a little darker, the wind's picking up, and you go, okay, it's time to batten down the hatches and get ready because there's a storm coming. But then there are those storms that just come out of nowhere. They come. It's a phone call. It's a visit. It's a knock at your door. It's a letter. It's a text. It's an email. It's an accident or an incident that has happened. 1 minute, the disciples on this boat, they were shuffling cards, and the next minute, they're gulping down seawater because the storm came suddenly. Peter and John, they were seasoned sailors, and they were struggling to keep down the sail. And Matthew, who was not a sailor but a tax collector, he was struggling to keep down his breakfast because this storm came out of nowhere and it begins to buffet the boat. It says, without warning, a furious tempest came on the lake so that the waves swept over the boat. It's interesting, in one of the translations, the word that Matthew chose for the storm. He could have said a spring shower, he could have said a downpour, he could have said a little squall came up, but he looked very carefully for the word to describe what he had experienced that night on the sea. The waves were exploding over the bow of the boat, the wind was blowing, the boat was rocking, the flood waters were coming down, lightning was popping everywhere, and he's going down a list of synonyms in the dictionary to describe exactly what they're experiencing on that boat. And finally, his finger comes to rest on the word seismos. Seismos. It means a quake or trembling eruption of sky and sea. He settles on this word. We use the word still today. We have seismologists who study earthquakes. We have seismographs that measure the intensity of earthquakes. Matthews and the others on the boat with him, they experienced a seismos that shook them to their very core. The word actually is only used 2 other times in Scripture. One is to describe the death of Christ when it said when He gave up His Spirit, the rocks shook and the earth shook and the rocks split. And the other one was described when Jesus was resurrected. The only other times that this particular word was used. It's a powerful, powerful word that describes something that is very awesome. And that's the word Matthew chose, a seismos. He said, we're experiencing an eruption of earth and sky. I mean, the world is coming to an end. It's awful out here. And then you read on in Matthew 8:24, he said, Jesus, where's Jesus in all this? Remember, he got in the boat and said, come on, guys. We're looking at the disciples. They're panicking. Where's Jesus in all this? Verse 24, Jesus was sleeping. That's comforting, isn't it? We're struggling for our life. We're treading water, and we're about to go down for the last time. Where's Jesus? He's asleep. Here's the scene. The disciples, they scream. Jesus dreams. The thunder roars. Jesus snores. In the frenzy of the storm, it's important that you don't forget who's on board with you. You see, it's not about the absence of storms that sets us apart as Christ followers, but it's in whom we discover in the storm that we discover Christ. You see, He's promised, He said, I will never leave you, I'll never forsake you, I'll never abandon you before or during the storm. I mean, if we could just realize that He is on board, He is in the boat with us. Isaiah said it, and in Isaiah 41, he said, fear not, I'm with you. Be not dismayed. I'm your God. See, the reason God doesn't want us to fear is because of what fear can do to us. One of the big things, and if you turn over in the Gospel of Mark, chapter 4, Mark records this exact same experience. He just puts it in his perspective, in his words, how he saw it. And this is the way it reads in Mark 4:38. He said, Jesus was sleeping at the back of the boat with his head on a cushion. The disciples woke him shouting, Teacher, don't you care that we're going down? It's interesting that the disciples didn't ask about Jesus' strength. They didn't say, can you still the storm? They didn't ask about Jesus' knowledge. Are you aware that there's a storm going on? And they didn't even ask about His know-how. Do you have any experience in calming storms? Notice what their statement was. Their statement was, do you care? You see, fear causes us to raise doubts about God's character and His goodness. Do you care? How many times have you made that statement? Do you care? God, do you even care? You may not say it out loud. You may not say it audibly. You may say it to yourself. But God, do you even care what's happening to me? Do you even care what my family's going through? Do you even care what I'm experiencing, God? You ever asked Him that question? Do you care? The answer is not what we want to hear. So we begin questioning God. Fear does this. Fear corrodes our confidence in God's goodness. I mean, if God can sleep in our storms, if His eyes stay closed while ours are wide open, if He permits storms after I've got in His boat, I mean, does He really care? That's what fear does. It causes us to question God's goodness and His character. It also deadens our recall. By now, the disciples, they had every reason in the world to trust Jesus. In Matthew 4, we read where it says He was healing all kind of sicknesses and all kind of diseases among the people. And just a few verses before the story of the storm, in Matthew 8:16, He said, when evening had come, they brought to Him many who were demon-possessed, and He cast out the spirits with a word and healed all who were sick. This is the same guy that's in the boat with them. They witnessed this stuff. They saw it firsthand. But fear deadens our ability to recall. It's a spiritual amnesia, so to speak. It messes with our miracle memory. We forget what God did in the past. We're only interested in, God, what can you do for me now? Makes us forget what Jesus has done and how good God really is. Fear causes us to lose sight of God and His power to save. The Scripture said the disciples went and woke Him, shouting, "Lord, save us, we're going down." They're thinking they're about to die. They're thinking they're about to sink. Their boat is filling up with water, and they're so caught up with fear that they momentarily forget that Jesus was in the boat, and they totally forgot about His power. Finally, when things had escalated to a catastrophic proportion, they remembered Jesus. Oh, yeah, Jesus is back there asleep. Let's go wake Him up. Let's go shake Him and get Him up. Don't we do the same thing? A lot of times in our life, we wait till things get so big, so out of proportion, so catastrophic. And then we go, oh, man, we need to cry out to God. We need to go wake up Jesus. I mean, we've tried everything else. Now it's so big and it's out of our hands. We need to go wake up Jesus. You see, here's what fear does. If we maximize our fears, we minimize God's power and His ability. But when we maximize God's power and ability, we begin to minimize our fears. And I think probably one of the most dangerous things that fear does to us is fear simply cancels faith. Cancels faith. Faith is just the opposite of fear. You can't have faith and fear at the same time. They cancel out each other. Fear causes us to focus on the what ifs, and faith causes us to focus on the who can. Fear gets us looking at the circumstances around us. Faith gets us looking at the source. Satan wants to cancel our faith, so he comes at us with fear. He knows that without fear, it's impossible to please God. He knows that without faith, it's impossible to please God. Without faith, we can't receive anything from God. He knows without faith, we can't even know God. So how do we wrestle with fear? How do you wrestle and manage fear in your life? I want to give you 3 things, and we'll wrap up with these. The first one is this. Deal with the issues of today, not the uncertainties of tomorrow. We could probably just end with that right there, if we could just do that. Deal with the issues of today, not the uncertainties of tomorrow. You won't sink under the burden of today's crisis, but tomorrow's crisis added to today's crisis will be a little bit more than you're able to carry. I don't know about you, but often when Marie goes to the grocery store and she'll come home and there's a bunch of bags in the car, and I go out and I try to get as many bags as I can get because I don't want to have to make a second trip. And on occasion, I've been known to drop something and break something, milk or a glass of, or a jar of pickles or something, and I have been known to drop stuff and break it because I was trying to carry too much, when it would have been so much simpler to just take a little bit, carry it in, go back, make a second trip, and carry it in. And I think so often we're like that, aren't we? We have all of our pressure and issues today, and we're already thinking about tomorrow and next week, and we're trying to get those bags, and we're trying to carry all of it at one time. And God said it doesn't work that way. In fact, listen to what He said. He said, "Therefore, don't worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about its own things." I love what one writer said. He said, "All the water in the world, however hard it tried, could never sink a ship unless it got inside. All the hardships of this world might wear you pretty thin, but they won't hurt you one least bit unless you let them in." First thing, if we're going to manage our fears, is that we have to be concerned with today and not the uncertainties of tomorrow. Second thing is we have to face our fears. A burglar broke into a house one night, and he had his flashlight, and he was going around the house, and he found a CD player, and he got the CD player and was putting it in a sack, and all of a sudden this ominous voice from the corner of the room in the dark said, "Jesus is watching you." Immediately he froze, and he turned his light off, and he just waited a minute and listened, and it's like, ooh, hearing things. So he turned his light back on, he went over and got the DVD player, and he's pulling out and unhooking the cables, and all of a sudden, here's this voice again, "Jesus is watching you." Immediately, he takes his light and he starts shining around the room, trying to find the source of the voice. And finally, he sees a parrot in a cage in the corner of the room. And he shines the light at the parrot and he said, "Did you say that?" He said, "Yes, I did." He said, "Who do you think you are?" He said, "I'm just trying to warn you. Jesus is watching you." He said, "Well, who do you think you are? I mean, who are you to tell me that?" He said, "Who are you?" And he said, "My name is Moses." He said, Moses, yeah, right. And you're warning me? What kind of people would name their bird Moses? He said, the same kind of people that would name their Doberman Pinscher Jesus. You see, sometimes you got to face the facts. You got to face your fears. You can't just ignore it and it go away. You have to face it. You face them now. If you don't face them now, they'll only pop up later. I think of the story of Goliath when he was taunting the armies of Israel. And it's such an interesting read when you begin to read the story that Goliath would walk out every day and stand on their side of the valley, and he would taunt the armies of Israel, and he would mock their God, and he would shout out threats, and he would challenge them, "Send somebody down in the valley to fight me, and I'll feed their carcass to the birds of the air." And this would happen every day. He would come out and challenge them, and all the armies of Israel would get out to their side of the valley, and they would be on their little bluff, and they were listening and watching Goliath, and it said after he made his challenge, they would all run back to their tents in fear because nobody wanted to challenge him. Until a little ruddy shepherd boy showed up one day. And it happened like it always had happened, day after day after day. Goliath comes up on the side of the hill and he shouts his challenge to the armies of Israel and defies their God and makes fun of their God. And all of a sudden this little shepherd boy said, y'all are putting up with this every day? Every day? Why don't somebody go do something about it? Know the story, David. He said, "I'll put an end to this." And he meets Goliath in the valley, slays the giant. He faces the giant and slays him. And then courage began to arise in the ranks of Israel. What happened? He faced their greatest fear. How do you face your fears? Let me give you a couple of things on how to face your fears. One, by identifying your fears. Calling them what they are. Be specific. Tell God your fears. I don't know why that's so hard for us sometimes, but just tell God your fears. The psalmist said in Psalm 34:4, he said, "I prayed to the Lord and He answered me and delivered me from all my fears." I simply told God what my fears were. And the second thing about facing your fears is to trust the truth of God's Word. Trust God's promises more than you trust your fears. You see, you can let your fears attack your faith, or you can attack your fears with your faith. Deal with the issues of today, not the uncertainties of tomorrow. Face your fears. Don't deny them. And then the third thing, and this is where I want you to take a step this morning. This is where I want you to take a step of action this morning. The third thing in facing and wrestling with our fears is simply this: give your fears to God. Give your fears to God. 1 Peter 5:7, he said, casting all of your cares on Him, all your fears on Him, because He cares for you. Giving God our fears. And what I want you to do this morning, you should have gotten one of these cards in your bulletin. It says, "My greatest fears." Would you get that out right now? Just take it out if you can grab the card, and there should be a pen somewhere close by. Here's what I want you to do today. It would be useless if we came and had a nice little sermon and everybody just walk out and go, "Okay, that was a great sermon, let's go home." I want you to do something with this today. I want you to take this card, and for about the next 30 seconds, I want you to list your greatest fears on this card. You're not going to put your name on it so nobody knows whose it is, but list your greatest fears on this card. Maybe your fear today is you fear that God could never forgive you for what you've done. Maybe your fear today is that I could never forgive another person that hurt me, betrayed me, and I just can't. Maybe that's your biggest fear today. Maybe your fear is for your marriage today. Maybe your fear is over a rebellious son or a rebellious daughter. Maybe your fear today is over your finances or the test result or a diagnosis that the doctor has given you. Maybe your fear today is just being lonely. You're afraid you'll be lonely the rest of your life. Maybe your fear is losing your job. Maybe your fear today is dying. You're in relatively good health right now, but you are always thinking about the end and a fear of dying. Maybe your fear today is facing a certain person or group of people at school or at work. Maybe your fear today is making grades good enough to get into the college. Maybe your fear today is a host of different things. What are your greatest fears? Write them down. Write them down on the card. And what I want you to do after you write these fears down, I'm going to pray. The band's going to come back and lead us in one more song. But after you write these fears down, I'm going to ask you to come forward and bring your card and just throw it on the stage. And then I'm going to ask you to pick up another card as you go back to your seat. And what we're doing today is by coming forward and placing our fears up here today and picking up this card, what we're doing today is basically we're saying, God, I'm exchanging my fears for a promise. And this promise comes from 2 Timothy 1 and verse 7. And it simply says this: God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power, of love, and of a sound mind. God has not given you whatever's on your list. I think I'm safe to say this morning, God has not given you that fear. God doesn't want you to have that fear. And He's saying that if you will accept that today, if you'll list those fears and you will lay them at His feet and say, in exchange for my fears, I will take you up on your promise, God, that you have not given me a spirit of fear for my marriage. You've not given me a spirit of fear for my finances. You've not given me a spirit of fear over my children. You've not given me a spirit of fear over my job. You've not given me a spirit of fear. But you said you had given me power, love, and a sound mind. You have given me an all-sufficient power to handle all of my fears and uncertainties. You've given me your unfailing, unconditional love that secures me in my greatest fears. And you've given me unexplainable peace that overcomes all of my fears of the what if. So today, God, I trade my fears for your promise of love, peace, power, a sound mind. I'm going to pray, and then as the band leads us in this song, I'm going to invite you to come and just place your fear cards on the stage and take God's promise. Put it somewhere where you can see it. Keep it handy. And every time fear pops up and you start thinking, what if and what could happen and tomorrow and next week, pull this card out and just recite it. It'd be great if you could memorize it and just pull it out and recite it and say, God, you've not given me a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. I'm going to pray, and I invite you to come as they sing and put your card here. Father, thank you this morning for your word. God, you never intended us to carry these fears that we carry around. You've said that you've given us power, you've given us your love, and that we can have a sound mind that is not tormented by the fears of what if. So God, today we call our fears what they are. God, we put them in writing. We see them. We know what they are. But we bring our fears to you. We give them to Jesus. And in exchange, we take you at your word that you've not given us those fears, but you've given us power, love, and a sound mind. In Christ's name.